I'm Jack Zenger, and I'm here with my colleague, Joe Folkman.
Hello.
I'm here. We're working remotely in different locations, and so we're examples of the very topic that we're talking about today. So today's webinar is working remotely, how leaders and individual contributors succeed. We are glad that you've elected to join us today, and we hope that we can give you some ideas that will be really valuable in your experiencing this very turbulent and very different time in our lives. So what's the impact of this pandemic on people working remotely? It's been estimated that prior to the pandemic, about 8% of the world's workforce worked from home. Since the pandemic, the estimates have become remarkably different. And as you see there listed, a number of countries throughout the world, the US at 34%, Italy 24%, and so forth. Interestingly enough, a publication from the McKinsey organization just recently estimated that in April, 62% of employees of organizations were working from home. So obviously the numbers are, have a range to them, but suffice it to say, a lot of us are working from home who heretofore had not been doing that. So the agenda for today's webinar is as follows. We're going to talk about the impact of working remotely on two things, on productivity and on employee engagement. We'll talk about the skills that leaders need to more effectively manage their colleagues who are working remotely. We're going to talk about the skills that the people who are working remotely, individual contributors, what do they need to do to optimize their productivity? My colleague, Dr. Folkman, is going to share with you your results on the self-assessment. We hope that you've had an occasion to complete that assessment, and we think you'll find the results really interesting and useful to you. And then at the end, we're going to ask you to kind of think about one of the topics that we've talked about, one of the behaviors that seems to be very predictive of those people who are highly productive at this time of working kind of from home or working remotely. And we're going to invite you to kind of create for yourself a personal plan of development.
And Jack, just one thing to mention here, you can see at the bottom of the screen that site bit.ly/ZF homework. And if you haven't completed the self-assessment, it's only about a 10-minute chore to do that. And so while you listen to us, you can complete that self-assessment and get that feedback in the webinar. It's an interesting issue, this whole issue from working from home. Now, there's an organization that did some experimentation with this before the pandemic. The organization's called C-Trip. It's a Chinese travel agency, 16,000 employees, huge call center. They wanted to do an experiment on working from home, so they asked people to volunteer. And those who volunteered were randomly selected based on the CEO chose odd or even. And based on that, half of them were told, you go home and work, and the other half stayed in the office. Now, working from home in this example is a little bit different because they worked from home 4 days a week, and they were home 1 day a week. The other thing is in order to qualify for working from home, they couldn't have kids in daycare. They had to be, and they had to have an office space or some space where they could work productively. Well, they did the experiment for 9 months, and after 9 months, they found there was a 15% increase in productivity. 9% came from working more minutes, and that was, caused by fewer breaks and sick days, and 4% for more calls per minute. And that was attributed to the quieter work environment in the office. It's a big call center. People are bothering each other, a lot of noise. the employees who worked from home had higher satisfaction and lower turnover, but lower promotion rates. So there was a kind of a cost from working from home. So C-Trip rolled this out to the rest of the company. It was interesting, though, that when they rolled it out after the experiment, 50% of the people who'd volunteered to work from home wanted to go back into the office. So keep in mind that in this experiment, people volunteered. They weren't forced to go from home. That's, and we're in a different environment now. And a lot of those people that volunteered decided to go back. And this is a little bit of the results. The dark line is the group that worked from home, and you can see the before-after effects of the productivity. And again, before, the dark line's below the other line, and then after, it's above the other line, and this is the turnover. And again, turnover was lower, productivity was higher. The other thing that's changed with working from home is the quality of work life. Average American spends 90 minutes a day commuting to and from work. And there's a lot of stress associated with commuting.
Commuting.
Well, I experienced some stress with computing too.
Me too. Both are stressful.
And also increased pollution. Now, they've measured that the pollution is significantly lower now. There's also a psychological problem. Anybody who's been stuck in traffic has experienced that and come home angry and mad. In fact, people would sacrifice 5 minutes of leisure activity for 1 minute's time saved in traffic. But also, domestic violence was found to be associated with traffic and all that. So there's some interesting values associated with that and some positive things. Now, before the pandemic, we had a little study that we did. It was with an IT department of a large investment bank, and they had about half of their employees who worked remotely and about half that worked in the office. Their theory was that those who worked remotely were, kind of not as engaged, and they didn't have as good a relationship with their manager. And so they wanted us to measure and kind of understand that a little bit. What we found surprised us, because we found that those people that didn't work with their manager liked their manager more. Which is interesting, that I guess absence makes the heart go fun. And actually, the people that work remotely had higher levels of engagement and higher levels of discretionary effort. So that's interesting that engagement goes up, your satisfaction with your manager goes up. That's all fascinating stuff. So there's some differences between this and our current situation. Jack, tell us a little.
Yeah. So let me just remind us of what's different between what's happening to many of us now and this C-Trip experiment. Note that the employees needed to have a room dedicated as kind of quote their office. They didn't have any young children at home during the day. They worked 4 days at home and then 1 day in the office. And then we noticed that 50% of those who worked from home also chose to go back to the office. So clearly there's a divided opinion. And about half the people liked it a lot. Half the people preferred to go back to a more traditional office. It's interesting that the chief experimenter who ran this experiment was a man named Nicholas Bloom. He's a Stanford economist. And he said in a later interview, and you read the quote down there on the bottom of your screen, the global work from home movement intended to maintain output and efficiency during the COVID-19 pandemic could actually generate a worldwide productivity slump and threaten economic growth for many years. Now, we probably ought to mention that Nicholas Bloom has 4 young kids at home, and he's been working from home, and he's found it a little bit stressful, apparently. But he did have he did have some second thoughts about all this happening.
It's funny because he was so strong an advocate for it before he did it.
Now, you remember back in the year 2013 that when this trend of working from home really began in Silicon Valley, that a very kind of unusual thing happened in that the relatively new CEO of Yahoo kind of became concerned about that, and she kind of passed on this edict to the organization that you read up on the screen to become the absolute best place to work and so forth. You can see what she said. It's critical that we are all present in our offices. Some of the best decisions and insights come from hallway and cafeteria discussions, meeting new people, impromptu team meetings. And so she took a little bit of flack for this, but she wasn't the only one who had some reservations about, is this really a great thing for the organization, or does the organization end up paying some price? We've all been reading in the news of late. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
The thing we're hearing from a lot of our clients is that they're really liking this, and they're thinking, we don't need all this office space.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and we've heard of some companies who have said, we aren't coming back in the year 2020 for sure, and maybe not ever. And so this is going to be an interesting thing to see play out. So the fundamental kind of issue that we have and today's reality is that for public health reasons, there's a large portion of our working adults who are being asked, or in many cases, they're being directed to work from home. A recent UC Berkeley study estimated that by doing that, there have been probably 500 million infections that were prevented by our collective practicing of this social distancing, stay-at-home behavior. And so the big question that we're addressing today is, how do we make that work most successfully? If you're a leader, if you're an individual contributor, what ideas can we share with you that would give you some help in making that succeed?
So we went back to our data set where we had these people that were working from home and those that didn't. And then we looked at the most effective leaders, the leaders who were rated the highest by those that were working at home, and said, what were they doing that the other people weren't doing? And there was 8 behaviors that emerged from the research. What we think is that these behaviors are going to really help people who have employees who are working from home as they try to manage them. And I think they give us some really good ideas and tips, hints, and suggestions about what the best leaders did. Now, the first characteristic of those who were better leaders working from home was strategic perspective. Now, several years ago, I took a youth group down to southern Utah, and we went to Robber's Roost. Now, Robber's Roost was where the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid hid out, and the police could never find them because this is a confusing place where there's canyons all over the place, and they had a hideout there it was really difficult to discover. And we figured out why when we got there, because there were canyons all over the place. Well, we took this youth group down the canyon. They had to rappel down some walls. It was taking a long time to get some of the kids down the wall. And a few of the young boys got down first. They got restless, and so they wanted to continue to the bottom of the canyon. We said, go ahead, but stop when you get to the bottom of the canyon. And so they walked down to the bottom of the canyon, but did they stop? No. They kept going. They didn't have an idea in the world where the camp was or where they were going, but they kept hiking. And in fact, one of the boys yelled at the other one after an hour and said, we don't know where we're going, stop. And the other kid kept going. I got the opportunity to go tell their parents that their boys were lost, which is awfully fun. But, you believe that if your employees don't know where they're going, they'll stop. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. People will keep going forward. They'll do something. They'll go in a direction that doesn't make any sense because you haven't shared with them a strategy, a vision, the goals, the priorities. And unless you do, they will get off the trail and they'll get lost. And I think this is really the most important thing you can do for people working at home is they're absolutely clear about where you're going, why you're going there, and how to get there. And Jack, I'm sure you have some stories about
Yes. The second behavior that we identified was one that we've called championing change. So during this time when we're working remotely, it is a little bit tempting, and there's nothing pressing us to make change. And so we found that the most effective leaders were those who had that ability to encourage suggestions from their colleagues about how do we improve our systems? Let's use this occasion to find better ways. They were really good at celebrating changes that are implemented. So they would really kind of reward and have a clear acknowledgement of people who had proposed useful changes. They were effective at kind of communicating a broader sphere in which the subordinates had latitude in which to make their changes. So this willingness to kind of use this time when all of us, frankly, have made some major changes in our personal life, to apply that principle to things that are back at the office, things that are in the business. And how do we kind of be the champion of change when we're kind of a little bit remote from the day-to-day actions that other people are taking and that are necessary to kind of come together for significant change to occur.
Well, and that's been critical in this pandemic. The third thing that was critical is when you're alone at home, it's really nice to know that somebody's got your back, that somebody's going to represent your point of view, will speak up for you, will be your advocate, will take your side, that you know somebody's there to champion you. And so the leaders that were good at representing the interests of the group and the people in the group and the individuals in the group, they were considered much more effective leaders. This is critical. You think about your people out there working remotely. Does somebody have their back? Does somebody look out for their interests? And this is really important, and I think it has an impact almost every day.
Right. The fourth behavior that we identified was one labeled technical and professional expertise. Clearly, your knowledge of the organization, how it makes money, its technology, how things work, can become extremely important at this time. And the most effective leaders were rated as having high levels of knowledge and experience that other kind of really played off of.
Yeah.
They were especially effective at spotting potential problems early.
Yeah. When you're in the office, there's always an expert to help you, but remotely,
Right.
Not true.
One interesting new arena has emerged that in which we need some technical expertise, and that's with the advent of all this video communication, video calls. So there's a new arena of technical competence that's maybe could be labeled, video conference calls using the platforms of choice, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or Skype or GoToMeeting or Microsoft Teams. Knowing how to use those, knowing how to get the full value from the chat box features and the ability to have people engage in side conversations. That competence is now an emerging capability that we all need.
I need some more skills there.
Yeah,
was taking initiative. And part of what we find is this ability to kind of think about what could happen, what's going to go wrong, what do I need to think about in the future, and then really, rather than waiting, and the worst thing you can do is to kind of let people get stalled. I mean, if you go to church on Sunday and the preacher says you're damned, that means you're stopped. And it takes initiative to keep things moving forward and to not get stopped. And the leaders who were good at taking initiative, who were thinking about and let people kind of move forward and kept people going, they were much more successful leaders.
The sixth behavior that emerged as being really important was one we've labeled inspires and motivates others. I think we all recognize that often the traditional manager has been very effective at driving for results, pushing hard, pushing relentlessly. Also, a very effective tactic or procedure is pulling, inspiring others. We observe, and our data clearly points to the fact that the most effective leaders do both of these really well. So what you see here is that a person who is low on both of them is at the 27th percentile. A person who is a high on drive, low on being inspiring or by pulling, 42nd percentile. And then if they're high on inspires but low on drive, 46th percentile, so not too far apart. But notice that if a person is capable of using the appropriate approach at the appropriate time, they are by far the most effective leaders. And so the big lesson that comes through from this finding is that, yeah, there are times when you want to be inspiring and motivating, but there also are times when you want to be a little more directive. I think especially at this time, there's three more things that we just want to mention to you, and that is the other inspiring behaviors that we observed happening is that there's an increased frequency of personal contact. People who are working remotely can often feel like they're orphans, that they're abandoned, and they miss the contact in the office. And so there's a real need for a personal touch, for this human touch. And so the third thing that is very inspiring and particularly needed at this time is that the leader radiates his or her enthusiasm and confidence in the future of the firm and what it can do and how it will get through this pandemic turbulence in the most effective way.
Boy, that's so true, Jack. We need more of that. Another thing that happens, and Jack has alluded to this a little bit, is the need for innovation. Things aren't working the same way. You can't do things the same way. You need to do some different approaches. So again, those leaders that encouraged innovation, that supported it, that were encouraging their direct reports to be innovative, that really helped them to be more effective leaders.
Finally, I guess it will come as no surprise to you to hear that the last thing our research showed was that the most effective leaders were really effective at being collaborative. When you're all kind of working remotely and you don't see each other, you don't bump into each other in the cafeteria or over by the water cooler, it's easy for the organization to kind of begin to fly apart. And this ability for the most effective leaders to make sure that there was collaboration still happening was really key. We all know that when employees are remote, they get conflicting requests from different people in the organization. And it's important that the leader help them kind of resolve these conflicts where their time is limited and they can't respond to everything in as much speed as maybe the party inside would like. Helping to resolve those potential battles is really a very important leadership process. Now, having said that, let's now switch gears. We've told you about what the most effective leaders do. Now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about what do the most effective individual contributors do? How do individual contributors succeed? Many of the challenges are exactly the same for leaders managing remote colleagues and the individual contributors who are remote. Some unique challenges that the individual contributor has are that the distance can lead to communication breakdown, the lack of visibility about their productivity and performance. People can't see what they're doing. Their feelings that they are kind of orphans, that no one is paying attention to them. So there are some unique challenges that all of us kind of feel and face when we're working remotely and not in daily, hourly contact with our colleagues. So Joe, talk about one particular problem from not working at home.
Well, it is a problem, and you think about it, it's this assumed productivity. When you have somebody working in an office, you know if they're busy or they're goofing off, and it's easy to see them. And what's fascinating is, and I just noticed this, Jack and I have offices next to each other, and sometimes it's 4:30, and I think I'm going to go home, but Jack's still working. And so I work a little bit longer. And that's an interesting thing. But now he's not there. I can go home whenever I want to. But it's interesting because we worked together for a long time. It doesn't really matter. But a lot of times if I go home early, I'll say, hey, I've got to run an errand. I'll make an excuse for that. But now you don't have to do that. When an employee runs out of work to do at 4:00, they got a choice. They can be productive or not. The problem with productivity is, what is your boss's perception of whether you're productive or not? And are there some behaviors that tend to communicate to your boss that you are really productive, and actually this helps you to be more productive? Well, we had the data, and we did research from 9,755 individual contributors. We looked at the feedback from managers only and their assessments on 48 behaviors, and we found out which behaviors were most strongly connected to a rating of effort and productivity. And we identified these 5 behaviors that were going to have a significant influence on this. And let me walk through this, because this is what matters to your manager the most. Now, even if you're a manager, you still have a manager, right? And so these can help whether you're a manager or individual contributor, your perception or the perception of others about productivity. So we're going to talk about 5 of these. The first one is taking initiative. We know that was one of the things that influenced managers. Secondly, we're going to talk about consistently delivering results. Third, demonstrates expertise and good judgment. Fourth, acting as a role model, walking your talk. And fifth, be willing to stretch. Now, let's talk about these. Jack, start.
Let's take the first one, taking initiative. Certainly one of the things that every leader greatly values in a subordinate is they're raising their hand and volunteering to catch something that's about to fall through the cracks. They're volunteering to solve a problem that's been kind of a gnawing problem for a long time, but we just haven't had time to get to. But it's really impressive when you have colleagues who raise their hand, who follow through when they're asked to do something, take something on, when they see a problem and step up and provide an answer or a solution to that problem. And particularly when they really display that they're performing at a very high level. Years ago, Peter Drucker made the comment that a lot of managers think that it's really important that they do a good job, that they work hard, that they're highly productive on an individual basis. And Drucker said, that's just not true. What's really important is that you do those things and that you make sure that your boss and your colleagues know that. And so it's really useful for the subordinate, from the subordinate, to kind of really volunteer to make things happen, take initiative.
And I always like it with my kids when I give them a task to do and they do the task, they stop. Right? Or they'll cut something down, but they won't clean it up. And boy, it makes you feel good when they go, oh, I did this, and then I saw another thing that should be done. And I mean, that initiative is just such a wonderful trait to sort of, rather than having to be told, to look for things and opportunities, things that need the help. The second thing is to consistently deliver results. I used to have this friend, Dave, and I talked to Dave when he got his first job. And I said, so Dave, he was really successful. I said, how have you been successful? What's your secret to success? He says, well, I'll tell you, it's easy, Joe. Every time my boss calls me in my office, I take in a notepad and he gives me a whole list of things to do. And I take copious notes. I write down everything. I ask him questions. I make sure I'm absolutely clear about what he wants me to do. And he says, and then when I leave the office, I said, what happens when you leave the office? He says, I take that list, I put it on my desk, and I don't do anything. I go, why not? He says, because he always gives me 20 things to do, and he'll forget about 10 of them. I just don't know which 10 he's going to forget about. But then in a week or so, he'll say, how's that project coming? And I'll say, great. and then I'll furiously work on it and get it done. Now, Dave's a bad example because he didn't do everything, but he's a good example because he took good notes. He was responsible for that, and he kept track of his commitments. He kept track of even the ones he didn't do. But, it's your responsibility to do that. It's your responsibility to figure out where you are on track. And it's so easy to say, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do that. And not, when you say, yeah, I'll do that, you better write that commitment down and you better be aware of it. And then you need to anticipate what could go wrong. Most people are terrible at anticipating problems simply because they don't take the time to do it. When they do it, they're actually really good at anticipating what could go wrong. And the third thing is be an example to others, is to set a good example, and then others will follow you. So next one.
All right. Yeah, I'd encourage you to follow the part of Dave that took the pad in and wrote things down, not the part of Dave that sort of put the list aside and hope that the manager would forget half of them. Anyway, the third piece of research that we discovered was demonstrating expertise and good judgment. So one of the things you most value and that really sets you apart from other people who don't display these behaviors is, that you just use good common sense, use good judgment. That if you know something, you share that knowledge and you share that experience with your colleagues. That if you see something, as we said earlier, that needs fixing, that you reach out and help to fix it. Being knowledgeable is helpful. Fixing a problem is even more noticeable. One of the things that really is highly valued is looking for trends and opportunities. When you're working remotely, you're not having this daily interaction that maybe would help you to kind of see these things. So all the more reason to pay attention to the trends of emails that come across your desk, the outside information that comes across, what you see happening, look for patterns. You can provide significant value to the organization by watching those trends, seeking for opportunities, and having an early view of that. And the third thing that we would just mention is that this demonstrating your knowledge and expertise and good judgment is your ability to represent the organization and your group to your management and making sure that they understand the needed changes that are occurring in the organization.
The fourth thing is acting as a role model and walking the talk. What we encourage you to do is always do the right thing. Be willing to provide input on decisions rather than sitting back and just letting things go. And add your insights and advice to decisions. Ensure that the organization does the right thing, and you are consistent with that. And set high standards. Don't be satisfied with suboptimal performance. Just because you're working at home doesn't mean your work should be sloppy or not up to quality standards. Act in the team's best interest. Ensure that decisions benefit everyone, and take other people's needs into account in making decisions. And then finally, build trust. What is interesting is that we know that trust is really enhanced by personal relationships. Well, we have less of those with working remotely. We're not contacting people as much. And one of the things you can build trust is to connect with people more often, send messages and connect with people, and make sure that there's trust there between you.
All right. And the final, fifth and final thought we would pass on to you in terms of behaviors of very effective individual contributors is their willingness to kind of stretch, to really push themselves to do more. And you do that by bringing other people along. You encourage your team members to stretch their performance. And you look for opportunities to continuously improve. Stretch goals are achieved by working smarter, obviously, and not always harder. But be aware of deadlines, finish projects on time. But this willingness to kind of push yourself a little bit outside your comfort zone and stretch to an even higher level.
Oh, those are good ideas. So, what's the impact of doing these things? Now, again, we measured managers' ratings on productivity and effort, and then we looked at how effective you were on these various behaviors. So if none of them were above average, your productivity rating was at the 22nd percentile. If one was above average, your productivity rating was at the 40th percentile. 2, 53, 58, 4, 66. If all five were above average, now this isn't great. This is just being pretty good at something, or these five things. But if all five of these were above average, your productivity ratings were at the 77th percentile. So that gives you some logic around saying, I ought to be pretty good at all of these. But there's another approach, and that is, wonder if you were just good at a few, and really good. You were at the 90th percentile. So if you're at the 90th percentile on just one of these, you're actually better off than if you're average at 4, right? So 90th percentile at 1, 90th percentile at 2, 76th, almost where you are at average at 5. 90th percentile on 3, you're at the 79th percentile. So you can take a strengths building approach. You can say, which of these is really critical for me in my job? Or you can say, I really want to be good at all of these things. So we did a self-assessment. The assessment measures your preference, your level of interest on the 5 behaviors, but it doesn't measure your effectiveness. It isn't a measure of effectiveness, but there's typically a correlation. Those things that have most interest for you oftentimes are most effective skills. Assessment shows you your scores on those 5 characteristics, and then it has a 6th one it adds in there, one that's kind of you're less focused on productivity, and if you're hitting that one, you're not you don't really care much about how productive you are when you're working at home. So that's okay, but it could spell some problems for you. But you look at those, and those are showing you your highest preference for the 5 different scores. And then we look at two indicators. One is your satisfaction from working at home and your engagement. Now, this is a 5-point scale. The highest score would be 5, the lowest score would be 1. So if your satisfaction score was 3, you're kind of, it's okay, it's not terrible, but it's not great either. If it's 4, I like it a lot. If it's 5, it's incredible. I just love working from home. Your engagement score measures your amount of commitment and engagement, discretionary effort you're willing to take. These are the 5 items in the engagement index. And you can see some of them get at satisfaction and others discretionary effort. We've given this engagement index to over 450,000 people. And you can see here how you compare to the norms. Now, what's interesting here, if you just got an average score of 3.0, you're actually in the bottom 10%. If you got a 4.0, you're in the 50th percentile. But over 4.0, you're in the 75th to the 90th percentile. So just be aware of that, kind of where your engagement's at, and are you more engaged working at home, and are you less engaged? So that gives you an interesting indicator there about where your engagement is. So how would you select? Well, if you have below average performance, that's going to degrade your productivity. But being exceptional at a few can really increase and raise your productivity. The other question to ask yourself is, well, what does the organization need me to do? If I were to do one of these things, would it really help me to be more effective at my current job? So which of these 5 dimensions are going to help me to be more effective? And think about those 2 things when you're thinking about which one to choose to work on.
So we would invite you to select one of these behaviors that would help you to improve your productivity. And Joe has described to you how you might make that choice. What does it do to you personally? What does the organization need? So just as a reminder, here are the 5 behaviors that seem to be really important for success working from home, working remotely. Again, a reminder, taking initiative, consistently delivering results, demonstrating your personal expertise and good judgment, being a good role model, walking the talk, and being willing to stretch. So we would invite you to kind of just think about that for a second, too, and say, if there were one of those that I thought I could do better and that the organization particularly needs from me right now, what would I choose? And you can jot that down on a piece of paper and think about that. When you receive an email from us inviting you to give us some feedback about today's webinar, you'll have a little box there that will invite you to download a development guide. So we prepared for you some developmental suggestions for each of these 5 important behaviors. We made some specific recommendations or given you some ideas about how you might be better at taking initiative or how you might be better at consistently delivering results. And so if you'd like a little bit of help or assistance in your putting together a personal kind of plan for how I might improve and therefore be a more effective colleague who, for whatever reason, either because it's directed by government or whether it's your choice to be working from home, how do you do that with the greatest success? So you can just sketch out a little piece of paper and say, here's what I've chosen to work on. Here's my goal. Here are the specific actions I'm going to take. And if you will download that development guide, you'll see some further suggestions that you might want to incorporate in your personal development plan. Joe?
Well, thanks for joining us today. A little quote here. We're habitual creatures, so anything we can do to bring good, positive habits into our workflow is really powerful. And that's true. And in the webinar today, we talked about a lot of characteristics of both leaders and individual contributors. one thing we know is it's great to have a good assessment of where you are today. In order to decide where you want to go, you need to know where you are. And so one of the ways that we think is most critical to do that is by getting 360 feedback. There's a huge change in the pandemic. Are you leading the same? Are your skills still effective in this pandemic that they were before? If you get a chance to participate in a 360 feedback assessment now, it might be incredibly helpful for you to get a good assessment of your current skills and effectiveness. Now, if you did not see the post-survey come up, we'd invite everybody to do it because we love your feedback. If you go to the site bit.ly/July Web 2020, you can get access to that survey. Once again, by accessing that survey, you'll be able to download the development guide. That's going to be a real help to you in writing a good development plan. And again, the more specific your plan is, the higher the likelihood that you're going to change and improve. Thanks so much for joining us today. We love to chat with you. And so if you'd like to chat and if you have some questions about the webinar, please give us a call. We'd love to do that. Thanks so much for joining us today in this webinar.